The fundamental existentials which constitute the being of the there, the disclosedness of being in the world, are attunement and understanding. Understanding harbors in itself the possibility of interpretation, that is, the appropriation of what is understood. The extent that attunement is equiprimordial with understanding, it maintains itself in a certain understanding. A certain possibility of interpretation also belongs to it. An extreme derivative of interpretation was made visible with the statement. The clarification of the third meaning of statement as communication, speaking forth, led us to the concept of saying and speaking, to which we purposely paid no attention up to now. The fact that language only now becomes thematic should indicate that this phenomenon has its roots in the existential constitution of the disclosedness of Da-sein. The existential ontological foundation of language Sprake is Discourse B. In our previous interpretation of attunement, understanding, interpretation, and statement, we have constantly made use of this phenomenon, but have, so to speak, suppressed it in the thematic analysis. Discourse is existentially equiprimordial with attunement and understanding. Intelligibility is also always already articulated before its appropriative interpretation. Discourse is the articulation of intelligibility. Thus it already lies at the basis of interpretation and statement. We call that which can be articulated in interpretation, and thus more primordially in speech, meaning sin. What is structured in discoursing articulation as such, we call the totality of significations Bedeutungsgang. This totality can be broken up into signification. As what is articulated of what can be articulated, significations are always bound up with meaning. If discourse, the articulation of the intelligibility of the there, is the primordial existential of disclosedness, and if disclosedness is primarily constituted by being in the world, discourse must also essentially have a specifically worldly mode of being. The attuned intelligibility of being in the world expresses itself as discourse. The totality of significations of intelligibility is put into words coinant zu work. Words accrue to signification. But word things are not provided with signification. The way in which discourse gets expressed is language. This totality of words in which discourse has its own, worldly, being sane, can thus be found as an inner worldly being siens like something at hand. Language can be broken up into world things objectively present. Discourse is existential language, because the beings whose disclosedness it significantly articulates have the kind of being in the world which is thrown and reliant upon the world. As the existential constitution of the disclosedness of Da-sein, discourse is constitutive for the existence of Da-sein. Listening and silence are possibilities belonging to discoursing speech. The constitutive function of discourse for the existentiality of existence, first, becomes completely clear in these phenomena. First of all, we must develop the structure of discourse as such. Discoursing is the significant, structuring gliedern of the intelligibility of being in the world, to which being with belongs, and which maintains itself in a particular way of heedful being with one another. Being with one another talks in assenting, refusing, inviting, warning as talking things through, as getting back to someone, interceding, furthermore as making statements, and as talking in giving a talk. Discourse is discourse about. That which discourse is about does not necessarily have the character of the theme of a definite statement. In fact, mostly it does not have it. Even a command is given about something, a wish is about something. And so is intercession. Discourse necessarily has this structural factor, because it also constitutes the disclosedness of being in the world, and is prestructured in its own structure by this fundamental constitution of Da-sein. What is talked about in discourse is always addressed, in a particular view and within certain limits. In all discourse there is what is spoken as such, what is said as such when one actually wishes, asks, talks things over. In this, something said, discourse communicate. As the analysis has already indicated, the phenomenon of koinonication must be understood in an ontologically broad sense. Communication, in which one makes statements, for example, giving information, is a special case of the communication that is grasped in principle existentially. Here the articulation of being with one another understandingly is constituted. It brings about the sharing of being attuned together and of the understanding of being with. Communication is never anything like a conveying of experiences, for example, opinions and wishes, from the inside of one subject to the inside of another. Da-sein with is essentially already manifest in attunement with and understanding with. Being with is explicitly shared in discourse, that is, It already is, only unshared as something not grasped and appropriated. All discourse about, which communicates in what it says, has at the same time the character of expressing itself. In talking, Da-sein expresses itself not because it has been initially cut off as something internal from something outside, but because as being in the world it is already outside when it understands. What is expressed is precisely this being, that is, the actual mode of attunement of mood, which we show to pertain to the full disclosedness of being in. Being in and its attunement are made known in discourse and indicated in language by intonation, modulation in the tempo of talk, in the way of speaking. The communication of the existential possibilities of attunement, that is, the disclosing of existence, can become the true aim of poetic speech. Discourse is the structuring of the attuned intelligibility of being in the world. Its constitutive factors are what discourse is about, what is discussed, what is said as such, communication and making known. These are not properties which can be just empirically snatched from language, but are existential characteristics rooted in the constitution of being of Da-sein, which first makes something like language ontologically possible. Some of these factors can be lacking or remain unnoticed in the factical linguistic form of a particular discourse. The fact that they often are not verbally expressed is only an indication of a particular kind of discourse which, insofar as it is discourse, must always lie within the totality of these structures. Attempts to grasp the essence of language have always taken their orientation toward a single one of these factors and have understood language guided by the idea of expression, symbolical forms, communication as statement, making known experiences or the form of life. But nothing would be gained for a completely sufficient definition of language if we were to put these different fragmentary definitions together in a syncretistic way. What is decisive is to develop the ontological existential totality of the structure of discourse beforehand on the basis of the analytic of Da-sein. The connection of discourse with understanding and intelligibility becomes clear through an existential possibility which belongs to discourse itself, listening. It is not a matter of chance that, when we have not heard rightly, we say that we have not understood. Listening is constitutive for discourse. And just as linguistic utterance is based on discourse, acoustic perception is based on listening. Listening, too, is the existential being open of Da-sein as being with for the other. Listening even constitutes the primary and authentic openness of Da-sein for its own most possibility of being, as in hearing the voice of the friend, whom every Da-sein carries with it. Da-sein hears because it understands. As understandingly being in the world with others, Da-sein listens to Horig itself and to Da-sein with, and in this listening belongs Horigkeit Zugehorig to these. Listening to each other in which being with is developed has the possible ways of following, going along with, and the privative modes of not hearing, opposition, defying, turning away. On the basis of this existentially primary potentiality for hearing, something like hearkening becomes possible. Hearkening is itself phenomenally more primordial than what the psychologist, initially, defines as hearing, the sensing of tones and the perception of sound. Hearkening, too, has the mode of being of a hearing that understands. Initially, we never hear noises and complexes of sound, but the creaking wagon, the motorcycle. We hear the column on the march, the north wind, the woodpecker tapping, the crackling fire. It requires a very artificial and complicated attitude in order to hear a pure noise. The fact that we initially hear motorcycles and cars is, however, the phenomenal proof that Da-sein, as being enthralled, always already maintains itself together with inner-worldly things at hand, and initially not at all with sensations, whose chaos would first have to be formed to provide the springboard from which the subject jumps off finally to land in a world. Essentially understanding, Da-sein is initially together with what is understood. Likewise, in the explicit listening to the discourse of the other, we initially understand what is said. More precisely, we are already together with the other beforehand, with the being which the discourse is about. We do not, on the contrary, first hear what is expressed in the utterance. Even when speaking is unclear or the language is foreign, we initially hear unintelligible words, and not a multiplicity of tone data. When what the discourse is about is heard, naturally, however, we can at the same time hear the way in which it is said, the diction. But this, too, only by previously understanding what is spoken. Only thus is there a possibility of estimating whether the way in which it is said is appropriate to what the discourse that replies is about thematically. Similarly, a counter-discourse that replies initially arises directly from understanding what the discourse is about, which has already been shared in being with. Only when the existential possibility of discourse and listening are given can someone hearken horchen. He who cannot hear, horn and must feel can perhaps hearken very well precisely for this reason. Just listening around is a privation of the hearing that understands. Discourse and listening are grounded in understanding. Understanding comes neither from a lot of talking, nor from busy listening around. Only one who already understands is able to listen. Another essential possibility of discourse, keeping silent, has the same existential foundation. In talking with one another, the person who is silent can let something be understood. That is, one can develop an understanding more authentically than the person who never runs out of words. Speaking a lot about something does not in the least guarantee that understanding is thus further. On the contrary, talking at great length about something covers things over and brings what is understood into an illusory clarity, that is, the unintelligibility of the trivial. But to keep silent does not mean to be mute. On the contrary, one who is mute still has the tendency to speak. Such a person has not only not proved that he can keep silent, he even lacks the possibility of proving this. And the person who is by nature accustomed to speak little is no better able to show that he can be silent and keep silent. One who never says anything is also unable to keep silent at a given moment. Authentic silence is possible only in genuine discourse. In order to be silent, Da-sein must have something to that is, must be in command of an authentic and rich disclosedness of itself. Then reticence makes manifest and puts down idle talk. As a mode of discourse, reticence articulates the intelligibility of Da-sein so primordially that it gives rise to a genuine potentiality for hearing, and to a being with one another that is transparent. Since discourse is constitutive for the being of the there, that is, attunement and understanding, and since Da-sein means being enthralled, Da-sein as discoursing being in has already expressed itself. Da-sein has language. Is it a matter of chance that the Greeks, whose everyday existence lay predominantly in speaking with one another, and who at the same time had eyes to see, determined the essence of human being as Zoyov exoft in the pre-philosophical as well as in the philosophical interpretation of Da-sein? The later interpretation of this definition of human being in the sense of animal rational living being, is not false, but it covers over the phenomenal basis from which this definition of Da-sein is taken. Human being shows itself as a being who speaks. This does not mean that the possibility of vocal utterance belongs to it, but that this being is in the mode of discovering world and Da-sein itself. The Greeks do not have a word for language. They initially understood this phenomenon as discourse. However, since the V709 came into their philosophical view predominantly as statement, the development of the fundamental structures of the forms and constituents of discourse was carried out following the guideline of this grammar, searched for its foundation in the logic of this logos. But this logic is based on the ontology of what is present. The basic stock of categories of significance, which were passed over in subsequent linguistics, and are fundamentally still accepted as the criterion today, is oriented toward discourse as statement. If, however, we take this phenomenon in principle to have the fundamental primordiality and scope of an existential, the necessity arises of reestablishing linguistics on an ontologically more primordial foundation. The task of freeing grammar from logic requires in advance a positive understanding of the a priori fundamental structure of discourse in general as an existential, and cannot be carried out subsequently by improving and supplementing the tradition. Bearing this in mind, we must inquire into the basic forms in which it is possible to articulate what is intelligible in general, not only of the inner worldly beings that can be known in theoretical observation and expressed in proposition. The doctrine of significance will not emerge automatically from a comprehensive comparison of as many languages as possible, even including those that are most exotic. Nor is it sufficient to adopt the philosophical horizon, within which W. von Humboldt took language as a problem. The doctrine of significance is rooted in the ontology of Da-sein. Whether it flourishes or goes to waste depends upon the fate of this ontology. In the end, philosophical research must finally decide to ask what mode of being belongs to language in general. Is it an inner-worldly useful thing at hand, or does it have the mode of being of Da-sein, or neither of the two? What kind of being does language have if there can be a dead language? What does it mean ontologically that a language grows or declines? We possess a linguistics, and the being of the beings which it has as its theme is obscure. Even the horizon for any investigative question about it is veiled. Is it a matter of chance that initially and for the most part significations are worldly, prefigured beforehand by the significance of the world, that they are indeed often predominantly spatial? Or is this fact existentially and ontologically necessary, and why? Philosophical research will have to give up linguistics if it is to ask about the things themselves and attain the status of a problematic that has been clarified conceptually. Foregoing interpretation of language has the sole function of pointing out the ontological place for this phenomenon in the constitution of being of Da-sein, and above all of preparing the way for the following analysis, in which, taking as our guideline a fundamental kind of being belonging to discourse, in connection with other phenomena, we shall try to bring the everydayness of Da-sein into view in a way that is ontologically more primordial. B. The everyday being of the there, and the falling prey of Da-sein in returning to the existential structures of the disclosedness of being in the world. Our interpretation has, in a way, lost sight of the everydayness of Da-sein. The analysis must again regain this phenomenal horizon that was our thematic point of departure. Now the question arises, what are the existential characteristics of the disclosedness of being in the world to the extent that the latter, as something everyday, maintains itself in the mode of being of the they? Is a specific attunement, a special understanding, discourse, and interpretation appropriate to the they? The answer to this question becomes all the more urgent when we remember that Da-sein initially, and for the most part, is immersed in the they and mastered by it. Is not Da-sein, as thrown being in the world, initially thrown into the publicness of the they? And what else does this publicness mean than the specific disclosedness of the they? If understanding must be conceived primarily as the potentiality for being of Da-sein, we shall be able to gather from an analysis of the understanding and interpretation belonging to the they which possibilities of its being Da-sein, as the they, has disclosed and appropriated to itself. These possibilities themselves, however, reveal an essential tendency of being of everydayness. And finally, when everydayness is explicated in an ontologically sufficient way, it unveils a primordial mode of being of Da-sein in such a way that from it the phenomenon of thrownness, to which we have called attention, can be exhibited in its existential concreteness. What is initially required is to make visible the disclosedness of the they, that is, the everyday mode of being of discourse, sight, and interpretation in specific phenomena. With regard to these, the remark may not be superfluous that our interpretation has a purely ontological intention and is far removed from any moralizing critique of everyday Da-sein and from the aspirations of a philosophy of culture.